Exposition, an LMC Experience original podcast.
Hello, welcome to the Exposition podcast. I'm your host, Micah. Renee Descartes is the sexy pirate Simms, and I'm with my co-host, or actually, my guest co-host, Drew Booth.
Hi, I think Natalie Portman is a sexier pirate, but we'll agree to disagree.
Okay, whatever. And we have a very special guest, one of my favorite professors of philosophy here, Edward Haven.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Like a true philosopher, I know nothing about what's about to happen to me.
Great. That's our goal.
So I like it.
All right. So our first question we're going to ask you is, what got you started in philosophy?
That's a good question. There's a couple things. I met my school teacher from back when I was in like grade school a couple years back, and I told her that I became a philosophy teacher, and she immediately was like, yeah, of course you did. So I guess I was that kid, and I was like, what do you mean by that? Is that just like was weird or something as a kid? She's like, no, you asked a lot of questions, you're always interested in that stuff. So maybe I had a disposition since I was a child, but I think what got me actually studying philosophies was a change in college. Because before that, I certainly knew that I could, I'd ask questions and talk to people about it, but I think a lot of people see in society we're not supposed to talk about these questions. Like, people don't want to have these conversations, so I thought it wasn't something you could do. And I actually got to college as an engineering major. I was going to do aerospace engineering. I want to transfer to UCLA and build rockets was my goal. Yeah, I know.
No way.
Laughable considering who I became. But I took calculus, and calculus sucks. Kudos to anybody who can complete calculus. But I got a hard F, not just a 50% F, but like a 10%, barely getting through F. And so I said, there's no way I'm doing 3 levels of calculus. It's impossible. Okay. So I bounced around. Did a whole bunch of majors. I left college and did some work at a resort washing dishes, and then came back to college. I kept and rocked a very solid 1.9 GPA for a while. I did history for a bit. I did, what else? Architecture was kind of my engineering for people who can't do engineering, right? But then I took a philosophy class. I never thought about it, and I took one, and as soon as I was 2 classes in, I was like, oh, you can do this. I just thought you couldn't do this. So I was like, that's it. I don't care what job I'm going to get, what it's going to look like for the rest of my life. I'm going to study philosophy. I'm going to enjoy it while I can enjoy it, get as much as I can out of it. And so that's what got me kind of going and started on philosophy.
Where'd you go to school for philosophy?
I started at Sierra College, which is community college I went to the Nevada County campus up in Grass Valley. That's where I grew up. I'm definitely a country kid. And then I went to, transferred to UCR, University of California, Riverside, which is a way underrated school, fantastic school, very supportive. If you're looking for that mirroring community college, the level of support you get here, you get that at UCR. At the other UCs, you'll never get that kind of support. And then I went to the University of Chicago for my master's degree, which was it's not technically Ivy League, but certainly want to be Ivy League school. They definitely think they're better than the Ivy League schools. But they're on that kind of echelon. So I got to see everything. I got to see community college. I saw state, university, and then I saw private, top private school kind of education. So I did everything.
For sure. All right. So we're going to start with the question in the room is, what is philosophy to you and why is it important?
Oh, that's a great question. I think, too, I love in this podcast, you always give people tricky questions to start. You always jump right in, and I like that. So jumping right in, we're all going to die. That's why philosophy matters. You're going to die, I'm going to die. Life happens, right? This is the thing. Everybody is always surprised how quickly I talk about death. But that's part of life, right? We can't pretend like it isn't. And so if we know we're going to die, if we know everything that we're going to do is ultimately going to come to its end, I think that puts a certain onus on us to figure out what we do with it, right? How are we going to make it meaningful or important or significant to us? And so for me, that's the root of philosophy, right? It comes out of that, what am I going to do to live a good life?
What do you think about religion then? If we have those things that we go beyond life, we have an afterlife, we have those to strive for. What do you think about that?
That's a good. So I think with the afterlife though, and Heidegger says this quite well. Even if you believe in an afterlife, all the things you're doing in this life will end. Nobody thinks you go to the afterlife and you were a baker here, you're going to be a baker in the afterlife. The only people who thought that, the ancient Egyptians thought that literally you just continue doing your job, which I think is kind of bleak. If you ask me, being a carpenter for eternity in ancient Egypt, not a fun job. But So even if you believe in the afterlife, right, what goes with you and what you do, this stuff ends.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, there's an existential death, right, that's still going to occur regardless. And so you still have to make of this life what you want to do with this life, right? In terms of the question of, if you're also asking the question of what role does God play then in determining that life,
Mm-hmm.
right, which is an important question to ask, I'm going to have to go with what Socrates says in the Euthyphro, which is, look, if God is a good God, and I do good stuff with my life,
Mm-hmm.
then a good God's going to be okay with that, right? I don't need to do anything else. Like, what kind of God would God be if I went to the afterlife and they're like, well, you were a really good person, but you didn't do these 3 things I wanted you to do.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't cut your hair the way I wanted to cut. I'm like, I don't know if is that really a God I want to follow, right? Is that really the kind of person I want to emulate, right?
Why do you argue, especially because I have you in my ethics class, why do you think that people argue against religion and ethics? What is your argument for against religion and ethics?
Yeah, and I first want to say I don't want to get painted as if like I'm anti-religion.
No, you're not
in this
anti-religion,
conversation.
no.
Right. Like I think religion is really important, and we can learn a lot from a lot of the, like, even Muhammad and Buddha, and I mean they are great philosophers in and of themselves,
Mm-hmm.
right? But why that's problematic in morality, also, and this does kind of go where I'm saying, is we have to figure out these things for ourselves, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
even if there's an authority that says you should do X, that's great. But if it really is what I should do, then I should understand that for myself. You should be able to explain to me, right? It's not just you do it because I command it, but because it'll help you flourish. It'll help you be happy. Right? There's an explanation that we can give,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's the goal in ethics, is to not just you do it because you're supposed to do it, right? You go to school because you're supposed to go to school, or you're supposed to be kind because you're supposed to be kind. But why are we supposed to be kind? Why are we supposed to go to school? And there are legitimate reasons, right?
Mm-hmm.
And arguably, again, as Plato or Socrates says in the Euthyphro, God knows those reasons just as well as we do, right? Like, God doesn't do good things arbitrarily. God sees, oh yeah, that is good. Being kind is good, no matter who you are. And so God says, be good, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm like, yeah, I see that too. I can on my own see that being kind to people is a good thing. So I'm going to do good, right? I'm going to be a good person, as best I can, at least.
Okay, well, I'll have a really very hard question for you.
Okay.
Who is the hottest philosopher?
This is a good question. This is a tricky question. Because there's a lot of good candidates. I mean, you gotta like mustache Nietzsche, right?
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that is a solid stash.
You gotta,
right?
huh?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
That, I mean, and then the intensity's there.
As you're swooning over here.
You know, Sartre has a certain charm, but he was notorious. Simone de Beauvoir called him ugly.
Because he
and
is.
said he was a really ugly mug. Yeah, he was known for having he had a disease when he was a child, so he had like a squint and a deranged
So
kind
he's
of face.
ableist.
Yeah, exactly, right. So
Okay.
so I can be pro that. So and then Socrates was also called ugly a lot by the ancient Greeks. He was
Mhm.
notorious for being ugly. So some good ugly philosophers too, that I think have their own charm.
Just haters, man.
Yeah, exactly. Just haters hating, right? But I gotta say, sexiest philosopher, I'm gonna go with Derrida, Jacques Derrida. Have you seen that man? He dresses in a suit, white shirt, unbuttoned, comb back white hair. handsome man. Yeah.
I don't know, Slavoj Žižek has that beard,
yeah.
though. I'm just saying.
Right? He's got that rugged mountain look. That,
No.
yeah.
Yo, please.
All right, let's get to back to a serious question. All right, so imagine yourself on a hill. You're on a hill, right? And you have a lever, right? And down below you see 2 tracks, right? There's 5 people on one track and there's 1 person on the track, and the track is barreling down to go kill the 5 people. If you pull the switch, it kills the 1 person, but if you don't, it doesn't. It only kills 1 person. What do you do in that circumstance?
Yeah, so this is good. I literally just had a class this morning where we did the trolley car, and like 5 students were trying to get me to tell them my opinion.
Well, you're gonna have to now.
And exactly, I'm like,
Okay.
I'm on this. You caught me in a trap, because
You're
I always
welcome
like
to all those 5 students.
I always like to tell students to come up with their own answers. But me personally, I'm not pulling the switch. I do agree with the idea that there is intention, and that matters in that moral decision. And certainly, I don't like the moral responsibility. If we assign moral responsibility, if those people really ultimately lays with the person who tied them to the tracks. Nobody talks about that in the dilemma. But the person who's actually doing moral wrong is that person. Right? I'm not a morally bad, no matter what I pick. I am actually not doing anything morally wrong. Because at the end of the day, I simply have the intention, again, this is why I'm an intention-based ethics professor, I have the intention to make the situation better. I'm trying my best to do that, right? Whether I pull it or not. But I think if I lean towards that intention-based, you get the classic Kantian answer, right? To pull the lever is to have the intention to directly kill someone, as opposed to letting nature take its course, which I would argue I do all the time, right? There are people being killed right now in the world. I'm not responsible for that. I'm not involved. I didn't do anything. Somebody else killed them. Somebody else did it. It's on them, right? So those 5 people on the track, that's between them and the person who's murdering them. It's just a happenstance that I'm there, right? There's not much I can do for them. So.
You say you do intention-based philosophy. Is that why you start with utilitarianism?
Well, so then we can go to, yeah, exactly.
We start with
show
the
you why
worst?
it's wrong. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well then, what do you say to the philosophers or to the philosophy professors who specialize in utilitarianism?
They're wrong. They're just no, I'm just joking. I'm joking. I think, and this is true when I teach my ethics classes, I don't think you can really just lean on one. I think a really developed ethical theory needs to understand that every single action has the type of person who's going into it, the intentions that person has, the relationships that then result from that, and ultimately the consequences, right? Like all of these are part of the picture, and so we should have all of them in some sense in this balance. But yeah, I do prioritize. I think intention is really important. I mean, I would say you've got that classic example of, to go off the trolley car, you've got you're a doctor, and somebody comes in, and they have a sickness, an ailment that they'll die if it's not cured, but you could cure it. But you have 5 patients who all need organs, who are famous people, super, like you have one famous super pop star, you have famous Nobel Peace Prize winning, you make up the stories you want, right? 5 amazing people. It would seem like from a utilitarian perspective, as a doctor, I should let that patient die, not care for them, take those 5 organs, right, and give them to the other people, because I'm creating the better world in that case, right? But that seems really problematic to me, because I think as a doctor, you have obligations and duties in your actions that prevent you from doing that. Even though you're a doctor and you could help these other 5 people, you have an obligation to your patient to still care for them, right? Even though the utilitarian good would be carving them up. And thank God our doctors don't do that, right? They don't just carve us up to like use our bodies for other things, right? It just seems wrong. So
I wanted to ask you, you were telling us yesterday about role models and how we should have role models. And I wanted to ask, what do you think a good role model should have?
That's a great question. That's a tricky question, too. A great role model, I like Aristotle's definition of friendship, which he says that a friend, right, and he means this, it could be romantically, it could be a mentor, it could be a friend. He means it in a very broad sense of the word friend. A friend is someone who makes you want to be a better person, right? Who, when you see them, you see in them these qualities that not just, I can recognize that those are good, but they encourage us to thrive and flourish ourselves, right? Because there's lots of great role models in the world I can look at and just be like, oh yeah, that person's doing really great things in the world, but then it doesn't change my life, right? It should have that motivational, inspirational kind of component to it. Another way to frame that maybe is around emotional, right? It should make me want to care, right? And that kind of care ethics kind of function of creating sympathy and empathy and care as I see this person. That makes me want to act, right? And do things in the world, right?
So do you think sympathy and empathy can be taught, or does it have to just spur?
Yeah, I definitely think it can be taught. I think people learn it. I definitely don't think I would teach ethics if I couldn't teach those things, right? I think that's a big part of teaching ethics for me, as someone who also has a very like care ethics training. Yeah, we can learn empathy. I definitely, you look at 2-year-olds, I don't think 2-year-olds have empathy at all, right? There's another way to look at that. I show this clip of the trolley car, going back to that, with a 2-year-old, and the 2-year-old kills everybody. Yeah, like the 2-year-olds, like they don't think twice about it. They're just like, oh, this is fun, let me just smash everything. So yeah, they have to learn empathy, right? And we teach that to them for sure, I think.
Do you think there's a certain point where that stops, or is it just forever capable of learning?
Yeah, I definitely think it's an infinite kind of like you can always grow and keep learning. Nobody gets to a place where you're like, I am the perfect empathetic human being and I empathize perfect, right? Yeah, right? That seems like that would be a weird thing to think. So I think empathy is something that we actually never really achieve, because I never truly 100% empathize with anybody, right? I don't think anybody has the ability to be somebody else at that level. And maybe we shouldn't want to, right? But but I think we're always striving to empathize as best we can in any given circumstance, right? And then as the context changes as well, right? The context changes, and so empathizing with that person will be very different than empathizing with the last person. We have to always adapt it and change it, and so it's always a striving for, never a completed project, I think.
I like that.
Yeah.
All right. Here's a very also rough question. What would life be without music? And also, why do you hate the Grateful Dead?
Oh, this is a good question. Please riddle me this.
Yeah.
All right, let me first defend my opinion on the Grateful Dead.
You're wrong. You're
Yeah.
literally wrong.
No, I don't hate the Grateful Dead. I think the Grateful Dead, I actually used to not like the Grateful Dead. And that's because they play that High on Cocaine song on the radio. There's like only like 1 or 2 hits that you hear over and over. And let's just be real, they're not good. Like, I am willing to stake my claim on. They're not good songs. You put them up against any of the other songs from even their own time period, they're just not that great. But I realized this when a student gave a presentation in our philosophy of music class about the Grateful Dead. And they basically argued that, like, there are 2 types of bands, right? There are types of bands that are meant to be recorded and they're technically proficient, and there are ones you listen to live. And they played the live recording from the Grateful Dead, and I was like, oh, this now makes sense. Now I get why the Grateful Dead is good, because of the show. And I always heard that. My uncle is a Deadhead, like, you know, his whole life, like, and he would say that, right? It was all about going to the shows and the concerts, and I get that now. I'm like, oh yeah. So the Grateful Dead, I will say, have their place. They're an amazing, from what I understand, live band, but I have never seen them live, so I have no clue.
You have to be enlightened.
But even their albums live, I'm like, oh yeah, this I get. This makes sense why people like the Grateful Dead. Still not my favorite band, but I get it. Yeah.
All right, but what would life be like without music?
Yeah. That's a great question. I don't think you could have life without music. I mean, in the sense that if life is broad enough, or music is broad enough, that's like saying, what would life be without geometry, right? Like, there are just angles in the world, right? I mean, maybe we don't have the strict, formal construction of them as like 90 degrees, but there'll always be shapes and angles. And so, too, music is all around us. It's just part of life. I think even if we want to think about living a good life, or this conversation is musical in the sense that there's a give and there's a take and we're responding to one another. It's improvisational, right? It's nature. I think those fundamental qualities of music are unavoidable. So it's more like music is a natural expression of the human experience, right? And they go hand in hand. I don't think you could have human experience without music.
I really sure hope not. That sounds terrifying.
Yeah, right? I don't know how you could go a whole day without even like singing. I mean, when you came in, just like half hour ago, I was singing to myself when you came and found me. I just had a tune in my head, you know? Like, how do you avoid that? Like, I think to be human is to improvise in the same way that is musical. It is to, and this is something that comes from Foucault and Donald Davidson, who's a philosopher from the University of Chicago. But to live is a musical act. It is an improvisational act in which we are doing those very same things, right, that we would do if we were in a band or performing.
So I'm on Broadway right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a very small stage Broadway, off stage
it.
Broadway.
Would you say then that like art is just like inherently a human thing, and when we see AI do art, like we see with ChatGPT, like is there something a bit off about that?
Yeah, I do. I think art in a really important way is a human expression of authenticity. And so the computer can emulate that, but that's not the same thing. It's the same way that you could get a parrot to say the same words I say, but it doesn't have meaning, it doesn't have purpose behind it, it doesn't have intention, right? And so, yeah, life is art, right? I mean, that's the kind of Nietzschean claim that the whole thing you're doing, if life is going to end and you're going to die, this is your work of art, this is your painting, this is your expression, in the sense of art as an expression, right? Yeah, and so the more we can do that authentically and as ourselves, the better.
I think I see those AI generated art pieces, and I think it's like uncanny valley. It gives me, like, I can tell, even if there's nothing saying that's generated by a computer, it just doesn't feel human to me, and that kind of freaks me out a little bit.
Yeah, and we shouldn't mistake too that the AI, like, the art that they make can't have meaning to us as people, right? The same way that this table can have meaning to me, or a chair can have meaning to me.
The viewers can't see the table, but there's a table here.
In philosophy, there's always a table in one's mind, right? It's like a forever referenced table. But that doesn't mean that they have meaning, that they're making that meaning, right? It is something I am creating. So even though the art that is made by AI could be meaningful to me, it is not an authentic expression of anything, right?
Gotcha.
The same way that, again, a manufactured car doesn't have expression, it's just a machine that makes parts, and right? That's very different.
This is a question that Drew Booth wrote, and I just kind of expanded a bit more on it. And are we merely a product of our environment, and would you expand on that?
You said this as a joke to me one day, and it stuck with my brain. And I was like, please, I wanted to ask you, but you just went into teaching, and now here's your chance.
Yeah. That's a good question. I would say we have an inherent thrownness. So that's a term to mean that we are thrown into a particular world, and we function within that world, right? Like, a good example is your name was picked before you were even born, probably, right? You didn't get a say in that just happened. And that name has implications, the way people have talked to you, the way people have treated you, right? All this stuff is a thrownness. So there is a factual construction in which we are part of. I think in a lot of ways, modern society is built in order to reduce us to those things. So we are often the product of our environment as a result of that. Society wants you to be, for example, a model student, and we're constantly trying to pressure you into being the perfect student, which is really reductionary of you as a person. But I do think the human being always outstrips and expands beyond those categories and classes that we're given, right? So I always have the potential to go beyond that. A good example of that, one of the reasons I think we're very different than AI, is AI can only follow the rules, whereas we as human beings have an ability to break from the rules, right? We can change our condition at any time. If you want, at any time, you can flip over a table, you can run away to another country, you can, right? Like, we actually have this profound radical ability to declare ourselves independent from our conditions. It's just, do we want to? And for the most part, I think we're conditioned and society's taught us that is dangerous and that is scary. And so we shouldn't do that, right? We should conform, we should follow the rules, that's safe. I'm writing an essay right now about the myth of Icarus, and that's a good example of that, right? The message of that is, don't fly too high, you'll get burned by the sun. And then you'll fall down to the ocean and die, right? But I think if you tell that story from Icarus's side of the story, right, we're all gonna die. We all only have this one kind of flourish in life. So reach for the sun, like fly, get out of the norm, do something different, right? Rather than, so it's reframing it as more of a story about phuesis. Oh my God, is that too deep of a dive for this to go to phuesis right now?
You could talk about phuesis.
Okay, phuesis used to be it's an ancient Greek word which captures the way that the ancient Greeks used to use the word being. I don't know if you're aware of this, but the way we use the word being is not the same way that people used to use the word. Like when I say this table is flat, that is used in a particular way that it wasn't used before. And so our concept of is universal and fixed, right? If the table is flat, the table is always going to be flat, right? Unless something comes along and changes that. Phuesis as a form of being is a being that rushes up, that flourishes into reality and then fades. So the idea is that things aren't as permanent and fixed as we perceive it, right? As conditioned by our environment, as we might think, but rather things come and go, like flowers come and go, or trees come and go, and so do people, right? We kind of rush up. Our emotions are this way too. We have these passions, they rush up, they're very present, and then they kind of fade down slowly. So it's changing too the way we think about our being. So there's a deeper kind of argument about even the way we talk about being is very restrictive and doesn't allow for this kind of more human flourishing kind of version of being.
Do you think if we talked about this stuff more like in grade school or in high school, do you think we would be in a different kind of society today?
Yeah. I mean, I imagine you're asking a question because you would think so too, right? Like,
right.
Yeah, like I'm a big proponent. I mean, I try to teach every once in a while high school classes for that reason. I think, there have been studies done that show that as early as 5 years old, children can learn Plato's cave, and the idea that the reality that they're being presented with might not be the real world. And so
indoctrinated.
Yes, start early. But it is. I mean, imagine if we had a world in which we spent, instead of spending every single semester learning math, I spent just one of those semesters as a kid learning ethics and how to think about treating people and caring about people. I do think we'd be in a much better position in our society if we did that, right? But yeah, for some reason I had to learn, binomials and things like that. So, which I don't use in my workplace.
So what do you think is stopping us then? If we know that would create a better world, why are we not doing it?
I mean, I think at the core, people are afraid of that. Again, like I was saying, I think we've done things a certain way, and it's comfortable to do things that way. I think the other one, too, in education, and this is true at the college, is we value things that are measurable. So I can really easily quantify whether you're doing well on a math test, right? It's just like you got the answer, you didn't. On an ethics exam, that's a much harder thing to do, right? It's a much more I like talking with my science colleagues because they'll always say, but you're so subjective. And I'm like, well, it's not subjective. I'm not just making it up. Like there are qualities that are that give us correct answers or give us the right moral result, right? But people aren't comfortable with ambiguity in that, the vagueness in that, right? So I think it's just hard for people for that reason. People are kind of afraid of that, right? Which is interesting because, our society values things like independence and self-governance, and you would think things like teaching citizenship and ethics and those things would be part of that. Yeah, but I don't know. I definitely say to students, philosophy makes it a lot harder, though, to just be an efficient cog in the machine. So maybe that's also part of it.
Rage Against the Machine, baby.
Yeah, exactly, right?
I was thinking about it, like how we discover new animals, and we're thinking that they're so exciting and new, and we praise them and we research them, and they have different qualities than all of the other animals, and we find ways to praise that, and we don't do the same thing for people. And I was wondering why we don't do that, and I guess that's why, just because we don't like change in our own world, and we can picture it in somebody else's world but not our own, which really just upsets me.
Yeah, which goes back to that question, right? I mean, I think the reason we don't change it, the reason we mimic the world around us is it's comfortable to us. It's harder to just do something different, right? But that's all that's stopping us, right? Is Ricord calls it our mimetic function, right? To mimic, right? When we see other people doing things that seem cool, we want to do that too, right? We just copy one another, but we always have the potential to do our own thing. It's just, we don't like it.
I wanted to talk about one of my favorite philosophers, Albert Camus.
Oh yeah.
One of my favorite books that he wrote was The Myth of Sisyphus, and I was wondering if you could explain that for the audience, what that was, and what that has to do with philosophy, or what it means to have existential dread as well.
Yeah,
Please.
yeah, it's a great question. So, I'll start with one of the things I like from Camus, which is, I believe, at the beginning of that essay, if I'm not mistaken, is he says, which echoes what I think philosophy is about. He says, there's only one philosophically important question.
Yeah.
And you should only answer that question, and then you can have the rest of the questions. But it's, should you kill yourself?
Mm-hmm.
Right? At the end of the day, you should look at your life, he says, and by no means by promoting people committing suicide, but
No.
he's saying, look at your life and ask yourself, why haven't you killed yourself yet? Like, what is it that you were living for? And if there's nothing worth living for, then why should you continue living? But really, I think the point of the question is to start to dig out, what is the meaning of life, right? Why am I here? Why am I doing this? And Camus says basically, right, if you haven't already, then you're choosing to stay on this merry-go-round ride, right? And it's a merry-go-round. You're going to ride around it, and lots of weird and absurd things are going to happen to you. It's kind of like Alice in Wonderland. You're going to see all these wild creatures along your way. And you can either choose to enjoy that and accept that about life, that it will be absurd at times. Yeah, and if you don't want to accept that, get off the ride, right? Where, and end your life is what he's going to say. So, yeah, that's the core kind of motivating question of this book, right? Mm-hmm. And then the question becomes, so then what do we do with life, right? If we know that at the core of life is this absurdity, is this baselessness, right? That really there's no reason to really keep going, right? I mean, lots of people give you other reasons, but at the end of the day, it's just up to you whether you're going to do it or not. What do you want to make of your life? So if you want the myth, that actually comes towards the end of the essay. There's this whole big part in the middle where he goes through three different ways you can live your life. And I think it's kind of like the heroic, the romantic, and I forget the last one, but there's kind of three different ways you can live your life. But the myth of Sisyphus then is to kind of capture this absurdity, this kind of angst of life, is this famous Greek myth of Sisyphus, right? Where Sisyphus gets punished. I mean, like all Greek myths, right? Basically, humans get too much hubris. They decide to screw around with the gods, and they get punished for it, right? Mm-hmm. But even then, even the gods are kind of cheeky about it. Well, they kind of know it was good that the humans did it. They kind of like that the humans did it, because at the end of the day, like, they appreciate their hubris and their
for the plot,
because the gods don't have that. Gods don't have that kind of fun-lovingness that the humans necessarily have. So they enjoy that he does this in a little bit, but they have to punish him. So they punish him to this punishment where he has to push a rock up a hill, and then every time when he gets to the top, the rock always rolls back down, right? And then he has to go to the bottom and push up. So he spends his entire life doing a job where he pushes a rock up a hill. And so the idea is that this is a punishment, right? Mm-hmm. But your life is then meaningless, it would seem. But Camus says, well, let's rethink about this, because isn't that what all of us are doing all day long anyways? We're just pushing some rock up a hill, and then we die, that rock will fall back down, with the exception of maybe, I don't know, a dozen, maybe 100 people in history. The rest of us just disappear, right? Our rocks fall back down, all the work you put into, making your job or doing your reports or your papers that you're writing for class. Like, nobody's going to read those. Nobody cares about those papers. That was a great realization for me as a student when I realized that nobody actually cares about my papers, because then I get to write them for myself, right? It's for my own advancement, my own self-worth, right? Believe me, as a teacher, it's not like I sit there being like, I can't wait to grade 100 papers. Like, I'm not dying to do that. We do it for you, right? It's for your own self-worth. But, so yeah, then you're doing this like everybody else is doing this. So he says, how do we then make a life out of that, right? How do we find meaning in that? How do we find purpose in that? And we can find meaning and purpose in that if we choose to authentically own that task, right? So Sisyphus can choose to say, this is my life, this is what I'm going to do with my life, and this is what I want to do with my life. Mm-hmm. And the moment he decides that's what he wants to do with his life, he takes the power away from the gods, right? Because it's no longer a punishment, it's no longer something he's being forced to do, but it's something that he owns as his life's project. And then he can push the rock up the hill. When he gets to the top, he can be proud. He said, yes, I got the rock to the top. And while it rolls down, he can smile while he walks down the hill and goes, yeah, good job, good day at work, good 8 hours, you know? And I can push this rock again. If you want another really good book, that's, I think, a better version of this, is read Woman in the Dunes by Kobayashi. No, I don't think Kobayabe. I forget the name of the author. But Woman in the Dunes, really cool book. It's about a guy who's like goes to the beach in Japan and he's like catching bugs on the beach. And then basically he gets kidnapped by this society of people whose houses have the ocean, the wind has swept all the sand. So they're like, their houses are buried in these dunes and the sand is always pouring in. So they've kidnapped him to live with a woman who needs someone to dig the sand out all day long.
Bruh.
I love that already.
But he slowly, like, it becomes his life slowly, right? And like he slowly kind of accepts his imprisonment. It's a very fantastic book, but also a very similar metaphor, right? The sand that's just always pouring in. I feel like that a lot of days when I'm just like, there's all this sand just pouring in, and my job is to shovel it out. There's going to be more sand, there's going to be more problems, but you're just there shoveling, right? So, yeah. So he ends up becoming obsessed with getting a radio, and anyways, he ends up finding himself in that world. It's a really good but kind of horrifying book that captures this. Right?
So based on that definition, the meaning of life is defined like meaning in what you do, or like surviving or living.
Yeah, well, and so I would say that question, like the meaning of life, is a really poorly framed question for that reason, right? Like meaning then isn't something that is inherent to life or inherently in things. It's something that we as human beings generate, right? Like when I interact with something, it can become meaningful. And you know this, we can make anything meaningful, right? The example I like to use is like teenage love. Everything is meaningful. Every little kiss, every little note, every little thing is important and significant, right? We as humans just do this. We can generate meaning out of anything, right?
For sure.
Rumors are this way too. You think someone's talking about you and you generate this whole meaning in your head of what they're talking, right? That's what we as human beings do. So we generate meaning. And so, right, the question is then how can we generate a life in which it is full of meaning?
Yeah.
Right? And a meaningful life is, I think, one, to answer this question, when we approach authentically, right? I think that's what Camus is challenging us to do, is to honestly own the things that we're doing. It's what I was saying about the work of art and improvisation, right? Is this act of authenticity to own our own lives and what we're doing, rather than letting somebody else tell us what our lives are and what we're supposed to do and who we're supposed to be, right?
Gotcha.
So,
well, that's about all the time we have for these for questioning, but is there anything else you'd like to let the audience know?
Yeah, take a philosophy course. Get it done. Like,
100%.
These questions are worth your time. This is the perfect time in your life, probably. If you're in college, you're trying to figure out your life and what to do with it and how it's going to work, right? Again, this kind of theme of it's probably been in the hands of other people for most of your life, and it's your turn to take that on. Ask these questions. Take a philosophy class. Yeah, and start questioning these things.
What about you, Drew?
As someone who just transferred to a philosophy major and as someone who shares a similar story to you, I would recommend taking a philosophy class because your life will suddenly have meaning. It becomes less about your grades or your major or your future or whatever anybody else has told you that your life is supposed to mean, and it's more about what you want to make it. And if you're interested in that, I would recommend taking a class with Edward Haven.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to shout out a couple things real quick. On Thursday, we're going to have a talk with the Nature Preserve on Thursday with the science department. And there's a couple other things going on this coming week with a talent show with the
Honors
and everything. So we would also like you to join Philosophy Club. I am they're having their first meeting this Thursday. I'm the president, so I do have some bias here, but thank you for listening. Thank you, Mom, for listening. Edward Haven, awesome interview. You have anything to add?
Love you, Mom.
All right. I'll see you guys later. Bye.